There is a specific belief about career change that almost no one questions. Because it sounds so obviously true. The belief that you have to choose. Stay or leave, risk everything, or change nothing. And if you've been sitting inside that choice for longer than you want to admit, feeling the pressure of it, turning it over, calculating it, setting it down, picking it up again, you have probably assumed that the pressure is the point. That at some moment, when the conditions are finally right, you will summon enough certainty to make the leap. What almost no one says out loud is this. The binary is not a feature of career transition. It is a feature of how most career transition advice is designed. And it is keeping intelligent people stuck in a way that has nothing to do with their actual options. This video is about the third option, not quitting, not staying indefinitely. A 60-day structured career experiment, private, bounded, and designed to produce real evidence about a new direction without requiring a resignation, a conversation with your employer, or a disruption to the financial obligations that make just leave feel impossible. By the end of this, you'll have the full architecture of that experiment. And you'll understand exactly why the version you may have already tried didn't work, and what makes this one different. So let's start with the part most people don't want to examine too closely. Why their earlier attempts at exploring something new quietly faded away. There's a good chance this isn't your first attempt at testing something new. Most people at this stage of the journey have already tried some version of exploration. A freelance project that never went anywhere. A course that got finished but never applied. A conversation with someone in a field they were curious about. Meaningful in the moment, then gradually absorbed back into the routine. And when those attempts faded, the conclusion most people drew was personal. I didn't want it badly enough. I'm not the kind of person who follows through. Maybe I'm more comfortable here than I admitted. Here's what the research on career transition attempts actually shows. Informal exploration fails not because the person attempting it lacks commitment. It fails because it lacks architecture. Specifically, it has no hypothesis. It has no defined success criteria. And it has no predetermined decision point, which means it can expand indefinitely without ever producing a conclusion. When there's no hypothesis, every signal is ambiguous. A promising conversation could mean anything. A difficult week could mean anything. Without a framework to interpret the evidence doesn't accumulate, it just adds to the noise. And eventually, the noise becomes easier to ignore than to analyze. So the exploration fades, not because you weren't serious. Because seriousness without structure doesn't produce data. It produces effort that disappears. What you were running wasn't a career experiment. It was career curiosity, which is real and valuable and completely different. The distinction matters. Because a career experiment has a specific structure that curiosity doesn't. And that structure is exactly what turns ambiguous effort into actionable evidence. Which brings us to what that structure actually looks like. A structured career experiment has 4 components. Every one of them matters. Miss one, and the experiment reverts to exploration. The first is a hypothesis. Not a dream, not a direction. A specific, testable claim. Something like, there is a market for the skill set I've been developing inside this role, and I can access that market without my current employer's knowledge or resources. That's a hypothesis. It can be tested, it can be confirmed or contradicted. I want to do something more meaningful is not a hypothesis, it's a feeling. Feelings are where experiments begin, not what they test. The second component is a test environment. This is the specific space, the platform, the community, the market segment, where the hypothesis will be tested. Not the internet, not networking. A specific place where the kind of work you want to do is already being evaluated and compensated. Freelance platforms, niche professional communities, a specific industry Slack. The test environment defines where the evidence will come from. Without one, you're generating effort in all directions and measuring nothing. The third component is defined evidence. Before the experiment begins, you decide what you're looking for. Not success, not a job offer, not certainty. Evidence, specific, observable signals that the hypothesis has something to it. This might be 3 conversations with people who are compensated for what you want to do and who confirm the skill transfer is realistic. Or 1 piece of work completed to a marketable standard in the new direction. Or a specific number of responses to outreach that indicate genuine market interest. The evidence criteria are set before the experiment starts, because if you set them after, you'll unconsciously move the goalposts toward whatever outcome feels least threatening. The fourth component, the one almost no informal exploration ever has, is a predetermined decision gate. A specific moment at a specific point in the experiment, when you look at the evidence you've collected and make one of three decisions, the evidence supports continuing, the evidence supports pivoting the hypothesis, or the evidence is insufficient, and you need more time before the decision means anything. The decision gate is what separates an experiment from a drift. It doesn't ask you to quit. It asks you to look at what you've learned and decide what to do with it. That's all. Research on how people make major career transitions suggests something consistent. The ones that succeed rarely involve a single leap. They involve a series of bounded tests, each one producing slightly more evidence, until the weight of the evidence makes the decision almost obvious. The leap, when it happens, is usually the last step, not the first. So now let's get specific about what those 60 days actually look like. Here's what the 60 days actually look like. Not a rough outline. The specific architecture. Weeks 1 and 2, hypothesis and environment. This is the only phase that happens entirely inside your head and on paper. No outreach, no portfolio, no market contact, just two things. A written hypothesis, one sentence, specific enough to be falsifiable, and a defined test environment. The platform, community, or market segment where you will look for the evidence you've decided to look for. By the end of week 2, you have a map. Not a complete picture, a map of where you're going and what you're looking for. That's weeks 1 and 2. Weeks 3 and 4, first, market contact. This is the phase that separates the people who run experiments from the people who prepare to run experiments indefinitely. In weeks 3 and 4, the hypothesis meets the market for the first time. One piece of work, one outreach, one visible signal of existence in the new direction. Not a finished portfolio, not a polished pitch, a first contact. The goal of weeks 3 and 4 is not to succeed. It is to generate a first data point. Data points, even negative ones, are what experiments run on. Weeks 5 and 6, evidence accumulation. This is where the experiment earns its name. 3 to 5 more data points, more market contact, more signals. The emotional experience of weeks 5 and 6 is often surprising, because by this point, the experiment has already told you something. Not everything, something. And something, after months or years of the chronic low-frequency wrongness, after the Sunday dread and the performance reviews and the quiet erosion, something feels different from nothing in a way that is difficult to describe and impossible to unfeel. Weeks 7 and 8, the decision gate. At day 60, you do not decide whether to quit. You do not decide whether you're ready to make the leap. You decide whether the evidence you've collected over 60 days supports running a next experiment with a refined hypothesis, a better defined test environment, and a slightly higher evidence bar. That's all. The decision gate is not a verdict on your future. It is an evaluation of a specific 60-day test. And the psychological weight of that distinction is enormous. Because for the first time in possibly years, the question on the table is not, should I blow up my life? It is, does the evidence support continuing the experiment? That is a question an intelligent adult with a mortgage and dependents can actually answer. Without gambling, without betting everything, without requiring certainty they don't have. If you want the fully built version of this day-by-day actions, the specific protocols for running the experiment without anyone at work knowing, and the decision gate framework already structured for you, there's a resource in the description built exactly for this moment in the process. It's designed for someone who is still employed, has real financial obligations, and needs to move without making the move visible. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Now, one of the real concerns for people in your situation isn't just whether this works, it's whether anyone will notice you're doing it. The stealth dimension of the experiment deserves its own treatment. Because one of the real obstacles for people in complex professional situations isn't just the financial risk. It's the exposure risk. The fear that beginning to look, to test, to reach out, to build anything visible will be interpreted as disloyalty. Or, worse, will produce evidence of departure before there's anywhere to depart to. The 60-day experiment is designed to run entirely within your existing life. Existing time, existing tools, existing access. Nothing new purchased. Nothing installed on work devices. No LinkedIn activity that signals movement to an algorithm your employer monitors. The hypothesis is written in a personal notebook. The test environment is accessed from personal devices on personal time. The outreach is conducted from a personal email address with a professional but non-identifying signature. The work samples, if the experiment requires them, are built from publicly available information and existing skill sets, not from proprietary materials or internal access. The experiment produces no footprint inside your current role. This matters for two reasons. The practical one: you cannot afford to lose your current income before the experiment has produced enough evidence to justify a transition. Running the experiment stealthily protects the income that funds the experiment. The psychological one, and this is the one most people don't anticipate. Running the experiment privately means the first data points are yours, not your employer's, not your partner's, not your network's, yours. Before you've decided anything, before you've told anyone, before the social pressure of having said it out loud starts shaping what the evidence is allowed to mean. The experiment runs in private first because private data is honest data. You interpret it without the weight of other people's expectations. And that honesty is what makes the decision gate, when it arrives, actually work. Now, let's address the objection that's probably been forming since somewhere around the middle of this video. At some point, you have to commit. Dabbling isn't a real transition. I've thought about testing things before and nothing came of it. How is this different? The difference is not the commitment level. It is the architecture. What you tried before had no hypothesis, so it couldn't be tested. It had no defined evidence, so every signal was ambiguous. It had no decision gate, so it could expand indefinitely without concluding. A 60-day experiment with all 4 components doesn't ask for more commitment. It asks for more precision. And precision, for the kind of intelligent adult who has been analyzing the situation for months or years, is not a higher bar. It is a more honest one. If this opens something and you want to take it further, the resource in the description gives you the day-by-day plan built specifically for someone in your situation. Link in the description. Also in the pinned comment. If you've tried some version of this before and watched it fade, what was the moment you realized it wasn't working? And what do you think was missing? You came to this video carrying a specific belief. That transition requires a choice, a binary, a leap, a moment of all or nothing. That belief was not irrational. It is how career change is almost universally framed in the advice you've received, in the stories you've watched, in the structure of every "how I quit my job" narrative that implicitly positions the resignation as the beginning of the real story. What this video has tried to offer is a different frame. The resignation is not the beginning. The experiment is the beginning. And experiments don't require you to have decided anything yet. They require you to be willing to find out. 60 days is not a long time. It is long enough to generate real evidence. Long enough to have a first conversation in a new direction. Long enough to complete one piece of work that tests a hypothesis. Long enough to find out whether the market for what you're considering has more room for someone with your specific background than you currently believe. And short enough that you don't have to bet anything on the outcome. The experiment ends. You evaluate the data. And then you decide not whether to quit, but whether the evidence supports another 60 days. That is the controlled version of this. Not the version where you wait until the conditions are perfect. Not the version where the frustration finally outweighs the fear in one decisive moment. The version where you run a bounded, private, structured test with a hypothesis, a test environment, defined evidence, and a decision gate. And let the evidence tell you what the next move is. You don't have to have decided anything to start. The experiment is how you decide. That's not a small distinction. For the kind of person who has been carrying this for a long time, who has been waiting for a certainty that was never going to arrive before the first move, that distinction is, in fact, everything. Not someone else's version of this, yours.